Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Supply Chain Insights webinar, Making the Digital Pivot, Imagining the Supply Chain That Could Be. I'm Allison Crawford, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Today, new technologies impact how supply chains operate, and the advancement of technologies and techniques will continue. During our global summit, we heard from leaders that are embracing evolutions such as advanced analytics, robotics, visualization, and more. Today, Laura will share insights and stories of supply chain advancements and the tools being adopted to drive this pivot in an effort to drive transformation and tell you how to get started on this path of innovation. Before I turn this over to Laura, there are a few items I'd like to cover. First, we're recording today's session and we'll post it on our on-demand webpage. You can visit our website to listen to this or any of the other presentations. Second, we'll send the slides to everyone registered within 24 hours of the conclusion of the presentation. We encourage you to share these slides with others in your organization, and if you have questions, please reach out to Laura or myself to set up a discussion. Third, we want to hear questions about our findings. Please post them to the Q&A or chat function to the left of your screen. We've left time at the end of the webinar to answer all of your questions. Lastly, we'll be live tweeting the event, so if you'd like to join the social media conversation, please use the hashtag SCIWebinar. With that, let me introduce Laura Ciceri, founder of Supply Chain Insights. Laura?
Well, thank you so much, Allison. And one of the things we'll be doing is we'll be sharing this webinar in our new community. So we're hoping to have people continue the dialogue after we finish the webinar in beepfusion.com. And at the end of the webinar, I'll talk a little bit about the launch of the new community and why we did it and how you can participate. So what I'd like to talk about are 4 steps in making the digital pivot. So I'm going to start with a definition. Then I'm going to go through a process that I see most of the companies, the manufacturers, retailers, and distributors that I'm working with actually moving through. And so the first thing that you've got to do is you've got to start with what is the definition for your organization. And an analogy that I find works, particularly for people that are from the 1950s and the 1960s, is the story of the TV. When I was growing up, we used to always talk about going to see a color TV. And of course, today we don't talk about a color TV. In fact, we've got a media center, right? It is all digital. And so as we think about, an experience about watching TV or using our mobile phone, we've got to think about, how do we help our supply chain leaders go from saying the digital supply chain to actually imagining what that supply chain can be when it is digital, because we no longer talk about digital marketing. 5 years ago we were all the rage about digital marketing. Now digital is marketing. But the question is, how does digital become supply chain? And we're writing and doing research for the supply chain leader, and what I want to do today is walk you through some steps about how can you help to make digital supply chain. Let's start with the current state. In 1982, we first wrote about the supply chain, and we conceived the supply chain, and it was from the customer's customer to the supplier's supplier. But I find many companies are not clear on their customer, and they're not clear on their processes to cross over the gap between operations and commercial teams. And in fact, often the supply chain has become another function. So one of the things that you've got to do is you've got to make that sign outside the supply chain door stand for more than distribution or sourcing or customer service. It really has to be the embodiment of how do we deliver against the expectation of the customer. How do we really drive new growth opportunities? And when we think about the supply chain organization, many companies are struggling because on average there's 7 functions, and we only have about 1 and 2 with procurement reporting to the supply chain, about 1 and 2 where manufacturing reports to the supply chain. And when source, make, and deliver report to the supply chain organization and there's a supply chain leader, this kind of thinking can happen faster. It can also happen faster if there's a supply chain center of excellence in the line of business where people are chartered with a digital project or digital implementations, but we find 1 and 2 companies have this to be successful. So one of the things that is useful to drive the digital discussion is really looking at the supply chain of the future and looking at world populations, thinking about growth and the fact that growth has slowed, and thinking about how do we drive growth in new economies, because when I'm in Africa, the mobile phone is the method of payment. The farmers in Nigeria are far further along in social sharing of equipment than I see farmers in North America. Or when I go to Brazil, that's a mobile environment where mobile path to purchase for consumer packaged goods is in a little shop. It's not in a mass retail. So as we think about the globe and we think about growth and we think about the opportunities around the world, the digital supply chain is really what I think drives new levels of growth, particularly as we expand into some of these emerging economies. Now, we've got a couple of barriers, and one of the barriers is the alignment between the sales team and the operations team. So one of our first steps in driving the digital pivot is to try to narrow the gap between the commercial teams and the operations teams so that we can take our digital processes outside in, that we can move them from the shelf or the customer back or from the distributor back, and we can embrace channel data, decrease latency to be able to better deal with the long tail of the supply chain, which the long tail of the supply chain is this tail that happens where I've got lumpier products, maybe it's new product launch, maybe it's a promotion, but the demand for these products is not certain. The timing is not clear, and one of our opportunities in the digital world is being able to better deal with the long supply chain and to be able to deal with things like customized assortment, personalization, to be able to fuel growth. And as we think about the design of the supply chain to do that, we've got to think about fundamental processes and how we evolve these fundamental processes. So let me give you an example. The traditional software that we developed in the 1990s was really built upon the principles of planning, checking, doing, and then acting with a closed-loop process. But as we think about digital processes and digital businesses, we're thinking about sensing. And the traditional supply chain doesn't sense. It responds. And so as you think about things like telematics data and logistics or shelf data or mobile data or all of the data about, our suppliers, our customers, we don't sense markets very well. And so how do we sense data? This data is typically of different variety. It's typically unstructured data. It's high-velocity data. And so how do we sense that data? And how do we take that data into new forms of business intelligence that may look quite different than the supply chain planning that we developed in the 1990s? And it isn't just sufficient to act. Instead, how do we test and learn? How do we learn about how products are working with customers or how we best get products to market? And how do we build supply chains that learn? Because today our supply chains respond with pretty rote responses. And then how do we shape and orchestrate? How do we shape in terms of what we offer to the market? Perhaps it's a different product profile. Perhaps it's a different promotion, different price. Maybe it's a different display. And then how do we orchestrate cross-functionally? Because one of the issues is our horizontal processes of revenue management, sales and operations planning, supplier development don't connect to orchestrate. So, for example, I see that most of the promotions in consumer packaged goods are based upon history, despite the fact that we have rising commodity prices and we actually have shortages. And so there's not a feasibility, and often people don't know what the real cost of a promotion is. But if we could orchestrate so that perhaps as we promote and we have higher lifts, perhaps we have a different bill of material, perhaps we change the supply chain in terms of where it's sourced, perhaps we change the supply chain in terms of how things go. This ability to test and learn and shape and orchestrate is not a capability that we have today, but we can have, and then act. And so if we think about these first-order processes and analytics, it's a very different way of working, and it's a very different way of design as we think about the evolution of supply chain processes, where we first started, and it was all about the efficient supply chain very early on, about efficient transactions. And then we knew that the lowest cost per case wasn't necessarily the most effective because we needed to balance customer service. And then we focused on the reliable supply chain, which really balanced customer service with the right product, right place, right time. And then with the downturn that we had in 2007 with the recession, we learned we had to be more resilient. We had to be better at the design of buffers. We had to be better at the design of postponement strategies. We had to be more strategic in the design of our suppliers. And then, we've written for about 10 years on the concept of demand-driven, of sensing demand and supply and shaping demand and supply. And so when we talk about the digital processes that I'm going to talk about today, we have the ability to be more market-driven, to sense markets, to translate markets, to connect suppliers, and to really build value networks, which requires us to orchestrate across these horizontal connectors, continually test and learn and improve the market, and this continual orchestration. So when I'm talking about digital and I'm talking about the world that can be, which we're a long ways away from this, I'm really saying to folks, let's think about our first order processes. Let's think about how analytics shapes this. So at our recent supply chain conference, Imagine, which I'm hoping all of you can make next year, one of the things we did was we did a poll of how are people investing in analytics or new technologies. And as we think about shifting to be more digital and outside in, we have a confluence of technologies that we can really bring to bear to redefine digital. One is advanced analytics, and I'm going to go through a number of case studies on advanced analytics. Most organizations are very early in their adoption of analytics. They're still investing in descriptive analytics, things like Tableau and Spotfire and QlikView, things that allow us to see but don't necessarily allow higher intelligence for decision support. And then we have predictive analytics, which is really the optimization that we have in things like supply chain planning. But as we move to prescriptive analytics and cognitive analytics, where I no longer have just an outcome, but I have an outcome that's better based upon current data. An example of prescriptive analytics is actually what happens on your mobile phone when you get an alert that there's traffic and perhaps you should take a different route, or perhaps you get an alert that your plane has been delayed and a substitute answer is given. That's a form of prescriptive analytics. And then cognitive analytics, which allows us to build rules-based ontologies to allow us to learn. I think we're 5 years away from supply chains that learn. So those are some of the things I'm going to talk about in analytics. But we also have the ability to combine new forms of analytics with streaming data on the Internet of Things. And so you can see as we move into 2025, with the Internet of Things, we're getting much more data, and that's streaming data tied to time phase data, which is defining new architectures, and it's structured data combined with unstructured data, which really causes us to have to define our data models and our data structures very differently. And we also have the opportunity to embrace 3D printing. So whether it's the printing of organs to test new drugs, or to be able to replace MRO parts in service industries, 3D printing offers a great opportunity, along with robotics and the evolution of social platforms. So when we ask companies at our recent conference, where are they investing, you can see that the dark blue is for 2020, and the green is for 2025. So the first step is really around analytics, and I'm going to encourage you to think harder about analytics today. And then the second is on the Internet of Things, and I'm going to give some examples in a few minutes of each of these so that they can sink in. Because what I want people to do is to think differently about the power of analytics. It's just not reporting. It isn't just supply chain planning. It's really redefining that supply chain to sense, to test and learn, and to think about the confluence of Internet of Things, 3D printing, and robotics. So we're going to go through some case studies. And let's just get grounded. So as we think about data, and this is one of my favorite charts that I grabbed from the web, and we think about structured data, which is our dark area, and we think about volume and velocity. The first thing we should start on our digital process definition is a chart like this. I encourage you, whatever the digital process is that you're trying to map, to start with this kind of chart. And so you will start with your structured data, which may be transactional data from ERP. It might be your social log data or your call center data, or perhaps customer data, or perhaps your supplier data. And start to put it into structured, semi-structured, and unstructured data. And unstructured data are things that don't fit in rows and columns. So think about pictures and maps and perhaps text, perhaps social sentiment. You've got lots of unstructured data today that we aren't using. And then start to put it in terms of volume and velocity. One of the issues is that our current processes today cannot keep in pace with the velocity of the data that is really needed to make the digital pivot. And so as you combine streaming data with time phase data and you think about processes outside in, this is a very useful place for you to start with what are the data types I need, what form are they, and where are they in terms of the relative velocity. And what you'll find is that most companies are investing in this dark blue area for structured data that moves on a very low velocity. And again, then think about your analytics. Where are you investing in analytics? Is it descriptive analytics, where you're getting reporting or perhaps visualization without additional intelligence? Is it predictive analytics, things like supply chain planning? Is it prescriptive analytics that has even a higher level of intelligence? Or is it cognitive? Today we only have about 5% of companies that are investing in cognitive analytics, which is really the ability for supply chains to learn. So let's start with unstructured data. And when we think about unstructured data, let's start with social data, because some people want to mine the social data. It could be rating and review data. It could be blog data. And people say, well, where do I start? And you start at the intersection of the social and the interest graphs. And so the social graph is really a representation of your connections or your customers' connections. And the interest graph is what are they interested in. And those are really inferences that are not clear. So for example, my social graph, I'm connected to over 50,000 people on LinkedIn and about 6,000 people on Facebook, but that's not what's interesting about me. You know, my interest graph is what's interesting about me that helps people to sell to me. I'm a gardener. I'm a weaver. I'm a knitter. I have grandchildren. I love to cook. And so the interest graph really opens up the ability to sell to me. So the mining of unstructured data about my interest graph helps you to really understand how this particular shopper ties to rating and reviews. Now I'm going to give you some examples of the use of social data. Levi's was a very early adopter of test and learn strategies. Essentially what they do is they take their new product line and they use emoticons. And they ask people to say, do you like it? And in fact, these emoticons have changed now to, do you like it, do you love it, and can you share it? And then they track the number of likes and shares to be able to give them lift factors in baseline lift. And this is a simple way of test and learn on a new product launch. Now, very few companies are actually implementing what I'm going to call listening post. I only know of 7 companies that have successfully implemented listening post, and I'll give you an example of 2 today. The examples I'm going to give you are Newell, Rubbermaid, and Lenovo. And so this also is from our conference about, where are people investing in analytics today? And you can see that most of the analytics is in predictive analytics with concurrent optimization or visualization, which is descriptive analytics. You can see cognitive reasoning, which we're also going to cover today, is next. Discrete simulation, which is different than optimization, is next. And then sentiment analysis. No one at the conference was actually implementing sentiment analysis. I took this survey and I also ran it by a group at Athens, Greece, that was gathering to talk about the digital supply chain. And again, no one was investing in sentiment analysis. So I think it's really interesting that we have so much customer data at our doorstep, but we're not using it. So this is an example from Newell Rubbermaid. Newell Rubbermaid has basically built social listening posts, and they meet with the digital marketing teams and supply chain weekly to look at their rating and review data and their Facebook data on their new product launch. And this was a product that they were launching, and you can see the product that's in the green bowls. And they had filled the pipeline, and if they weren't listening, they would have thought that everything was going great about that product launch. However, as they listen, they start to see that these rating and reviews are not doing so well. And in fact, the appearance, durability, but look at quality. Customers are not liking the quality or the ease of use. And they started to see these customer comments. I was so disappointed in the Product Saver, which is the name of the product. I purchased it. I put freshly torn lettuce and filled it with the same. And after 2 days, the lettuce turned brown. Well, this product was designed to keep lettuce fresh. So what the Newell Rubbermaid team found out was they had a product usage issue. They had not told the customer not to wash the product. When you wash the lettuce, it would turn brown and it would decay in the bowls. And so what they wanted was lettuce that was not washed to be in the bowl. So they started a usage campaign, and they actually saved this new product launch. I can't tell you how many times people sit and they read pipeline data as inventory shipped into the channel, and they don't tie that rating and review data back to baseline list or the decision to make the second run in production. It's an example of the use of sentiment data or unstructured data in the supply chain. Now, also at my conference, I had Lenovo speak on the voice of the customer, and Lenovo has actually set up listening posts to listen to unstructured data, and you can see the dark areas around where they're listening. They're typically product names, or the yoga is a type of promotion on this type of screen that they're doing. And what they do is they take this unstructured data mining and they look at patterns in the unstructured data mining, and they're looking weekly, and they share this data with their new product launch teams about what's happening with their products. So this requires unstructured text mining. It requires the coding of unstructured text mining to become useful in the listening post. And you can see here that they had 6 recorded issues on one product, and they talk about it in a near real time. And they also listened for opportunities, right? I wish this product came with more USB ports, or the screen is so much easier to clean than my old machine. This kind of information to the product teams is invaluable. So this is an example of sentiment mining and unstructured text and listening posts. One of, I think, our great opportunities to start is the building of listening posts between social data, product launch, and quality to be able to listen to the shopper. Another opportunity is cognitive learning. I think we're 5 years away from supply chains that learn as we sleep. Now, if you think about, the first evolution of supply chain technologies in the 1990s, it was built around optimization for functional regional supply chains, and we really did not have the ability to have multiple ifs to multiple thens. And this is the representation of an ontology. So if you think about rules, and each of the line is a rule, and you think about the dots, and each of the dots is a decision, and you think about the colors of the dots, it's a type of analytics that's used at the node of the rules. So for example, things like ATP, available to promise, or allocation, or inventory matching, or perhaps it's something about promotion planning or price management. What we found in the 1990s technology was single ifs to single thens were not sufficient. But if we could have a rules-based ontology, and at each of the node we could bring in unique forms of analytics, then we could drive, test, and learn. Then we could help in terms of learning so that we didn't have so many exceptions to wade through. It allows the supply chain to learn as we go. Oh, that carrier always is late. Oh, that product is always damaged. You know, when I worked at Clorox, I actually had a year of returns on a product because it was miscoded in master data, and I couldn't see it, right? We have all these things that are going on in the supply chain that we can't see, and if we could have learning supply chains, we would allow the adaptation of the supply chain for cognitive learning. Watson is an example of IBM of cognitive learning, but we're starting to see other best-of-breed vendors evolve cognitive learning. You start with a rules-based ontology, which is a system of truths, and you match multiple ifs to multiple thens, and then you match in the nodes the type of analytics. Only early adopters today are really working with cognitive learning. It's very early but very promising. So about 9% are considering adopting. Often it's in quality, where we're looking at some of the semiconductor industry is looking at die banks and fabrication and what's happening between temperature and humidity and sanitary condition on the quality of the wafers. Or it could be in transportation as we think about modes and we think about variability. There are lots of opportunities. I'm going to give you here one from Intera Solutions where they're looking at test and learn across channel, and they're thinking about where should I store inventory. The issue is that most retailers broad brush assortments, and so as we think about what inventory should be in which store and what should I be selling at certain stores based upon demographics and what should I be selling online, this is a cognitive engine that really allows the learning about each store, the online experience, and gives recommendations about what should be in the store and what the inventory level should be. So that's a little bit about analytics. Now as we get into the second phase, which is the definition of building outside-in processes. And to do this, what I would encourage you to do after you do the data exercise that I talked about, and you really brainstorm on analytics, what I want you to do next is build an outside-in process. And today, most of our processes are really based upon orders and shipments, data that's late and has lots of latency and doesn't represent the channel and doesn't allow us to sense. But as we build an outside-in processes, we have to think about the moments of truth, and we have to map that process from the shelf or the customer or the patient or the distributor, whoever is using the product, and we've got to say, what are the moments of truth in the supply chain? Again, we crossed over operations and sales so we can work together on this. And this is an example of a digital process for digital path to purchase. And so as we get into digital path to purchase, which is a growing project in many of the food and beverage and consumer packaged goods companies, we think about a digital list. So the first thing we got to think about is, how do we get on the list? You know, it could be digital recipes, it could be ratings and reviews, it could be digital coupons. And then we have to think about, how do we get in the basket? Is it shelf sensing? Is it QR codes? Is it in-store coupons? Is it localized assortment, something special? Maybe it's a promotion for a local school. Maybe it's something where I've got points that, you know, I turn in cartons for my kids' school program. And then the checkout, which, you know, we've still got a big gap to fill in using point of sale and channel data. Most companies that have channel data are still not using it in the supply chain. We're just very early in that, and vendor-managed inventory is still operating in isolation in most organizations. But how do we build this process so that we can shorten the latency of the checkout to use downstream and loyalty data? And then when we actually have usage, which these are our 4 moments of truth, how do we know what the customer wanted with sentiment, rating, and reviews? So this is an example of a digital process. It's outside in. I'm starting from the patient or the customer back, and I'm mapping the moments of truth, and with each moment of truth, I'm giving a digital definition. Now, you can see that from the research we're doing that, the digital path to purchase is a very high-rated project for consumer packaged goods and food and beverage. But it looks very different at different companies. And so let me give you an example of Anheuser-Busch. So Anheuser-Busch enlisted bud hunters, people that could go to the shelf and let them know that the shelf is empty. So you can see I've got a mobile phone. This is actually an old project. You can see it's an older mobile phone. And I scan the shelf, and it basically says that shelf is empty. So I've got a bud hunter. And it's a person that really likes this particular product and scans the shelf to say, I've snapped the tag and we're out of stock. Now, that particular signal goes to the retailer and, it says, thank you for letting bud hunters know about your beer being out of stock. And it looks like this particular store is out of Bud Light, and now they're upselling to say, why don't you grab some Bud Select and take it $2 off? So this is an example of a digital path to purchase. And then they send a signal to the retailer to say, here is an example of, you're out of stock. Our Bud Hunters have tagged this product. So this is an example of mobile QR tags, digital data, and really pathing this on the moments of truth back. Now, we talked about analytics, we talked about data, and now we're going to talk about 3D printing and the Internet of Things, and I'm going to give you some examples. So many times people say, well, 3D printing, how is it going to change my supply chain? And the first conference I had about Imagine the Supply Chain of the Future, I invested in having a professor from Arizona State University come. He was actually doing some great research on 3D printing, and I asked him to tell the audience how 3D printing would change the life sciences supply chain. And he pulled a baby heart out of his pocket. And everybody gasped, right? A baby heart. And his vision of the future is that we can print human organs. We can have 3D images before an operation, and we can print an organ. And that we'll no longer have lists of organ transplants. And that may seem very far off. We've got a lot of work to do, but I am working with customers who are printing cancer tumors and testing drugs on the cancer tumors. So they go in, they get the cells, they build the tumor, and they test the drugs. And then transmission of that generic map of what works on that cancer tumor is then going into R&D. I also, at the second conference, had Logitech talk about the ultimate ear. And so this ear is actually, or earbud is actually designed for the extreme audiophile. It's the person that does, wonderful concerts, a music connoisseur. These are custom-made earbuds. And they had a problem in their supply chain with how to make these customized earbuds. The real allure of the product was that these could be customized. They could have diamonds on them. They could be gold. Then they matched the ear canal. And so they always had problems with, the lead times and the fact that they were out of stock. So they went to 3D printing, and they actually print these now on demand. We see this also in orthodontics. I think it could shape medical device supply chain so that we don't have hips and knees rolling around in trunk stock. I also think it could dramatically change our ability to have parts. So there are certain parts that can be printed at the UPS store, and you can pick them up, or at the Sears store, and you can pick them up, things like bushings and perhaps O-rings. And so we're starting to see a big movement on 3D printing. We're also starting to see a lot of work around the Internet of Things. So this is an example of Costa Coffee. Costa is in England. If you're in the UK, I encourage you to go have some Costa Coffee. And essentially what they're doing is they have automated the barista so that the barista sends a real-time signal. These are automated coffee machines, and this is not as automated as they'd like it now, but they're working on it. And it's far more automated than the Coca-Cola machines that you see in a lot of restaurants. But when people walk up and they get a cup of coffee, it sends a batch signal for replenishment, which basically says at this store I have this many cups used, I have this much coffee used, and they're getting a real-time signal. They're sensing off of what's happening in the store. And their vision is to grow over 2020 to be able to build a digital platform, not only for themselves, but also to connect it to their suppliers and to be able to totally eliminate the latency in the supply chain. Now, I was at a TraceLink conference last week, and I had a wonderful presentation from FFF Enterprises. And FFF Enterprises has RFID cabinets in hospitals. And they sell biologics and vaccines that really require tight control of temperature, lot codes, and they invoice when this product is used. So instead of charging when they put product in the channel, they're charging on usage. And so often on these Internet of Things projects, you'll see a shift in how people are charged. And these cabinets in the hospitals give alerts on where they are on inventory, the temperatures, the expiration, the inventory, and the usage. And so as people need products, so this was actually an operation that was scheduled, and they needed a total of 24 boxes. It was a very major case, very unique, and they didn't have enough of the inventory in that particular cabinet. So what they did was they did a query with local hospitals, and they basically are trying to see who else in Texas has the product, and it was a product for hemoglobin, and they were able to source where the product was, and they were able to then very quickly do an in-transit based upon the storage cabinets and the real-time information on lot codes and temperature and quality of the product to be able to transfer the product. 4 hospitals were able to transfer to take care of this patient, and they were able to have great outcomes for their patient. Now, in the old-fashioned supply chain, we wouldn't have known how much inventory was in a case. We wouldn't have the ability to connect in real time to make the transfer. And we probably wouldn't have been able to get the product to the particular patient. This is a new business model for FFF. They basically invested in the cabinets. They changed the supply chain so that they are actually paid on usage, not paid on when they go in. And they've designed their model for the Internet of Things. So it's an example of the usage of Internet of Things. The other thing that I see happening on the use of Internet of Things is really looking at fresh produce or chicken or pork or poultry. We waste an awful lot of food. In fact, on these particular strawberries that were being shipped in from Mexico, a third of the product was being wasted. And it was due to temperature variations in the truck itself. So what they did was they started putting temperature sensing devices on the actual cases, and then when the cases came into the DC, they would stack the cases based upon temperature conditions, and they would make the decision where to put them. So the goods in blue were of one temperature, and they could be put in the racks. The strawberries in green could be cross-stocked because they had some temperature. And then those that had greater temperature conditions were stacked for disposal. So it allows people to be able to look at real-time temperature conditions of product. And one of the issues on the supply chain is we say that a product has a code date, but that's only an estimated code date. And, as we think about things like drugs that, have serious degradation with temperature, or fruits and vegetables, or chickens, the redefining the cold chain becomes really important. So another opportunity in digital supply chain is the definition of visibility. And often I'll work with a company and they'll say, wow, we really need to improve visibility. And I will say, well, what do you mean by visibility? And everybody will look at me like I'm the stupidest analyst in the world. But, from our Shaman Circle call we did the other day, these were the notes, that it really needs to be role-based, that different people within organizations have different needs of visibility. And it needs to be information that makes sense for transforming the supply chain when shared by suppliers. In fact, we had a discussion about this on the call, and a couple of suppliers said, a manufacturer sharing their forecast is really worthless because the forecast for a manufacturer, even if they're a good one, typically have a 30% error and a 9-point bias. And by the time we actually get to sharing forecasts with suppliers, we have a 60 to 70% error. So what the supplier really wants is the manufacturing schedule, the real-time information about what's being scheduled on the manufacturing line. And they want to know it in the cadence of, when did you know it and when did I know it? And then within the enterprise, it's really about shortening the time to know things, right? It's visibility with the right cadence and tying data to decisions. And you got to get the language right? People believe sometimes we get too fancy and we lose the basics. So when we think about supply chain visibility, there are lots of different elements of supply chain visibility. And the digital supply chain has an opportunity to redefine visibility for greater performance. So when we look at our current state and we look at what's important and we look at performance, within the manufacturing company itself, we're not doing too bad. However, if we look at enterprise order management is an area that is just ready to be redefined. Or if we look at first-tier suppliers or transportation, we've got huge gaps. And in fact, most people, don't even know where to get started on the use of telematics data or GPS or mapping data or data from the cabs of the trucks, or to be able to look at, the sensors on ocean freight. And so as we think about these digital supply chains, we've got to really think about this. And then, as we think about visibility, we've got to think about latency and we've got to lay it against analytics, right? So when I talked about having that whiteboard session, starting with the data, starting with the analytics types, and then looking at, building networks that have canonical infrastructure and many-to-many data models, that's where the beauty really happens. So I'm going to wrap up now and take a few questions and just give you some summary. As you start to think about the digital supply chain, a couple of things for you to think about is the old projects around transactional data was really based upon a large project with a known outcome. As we think about building digital supply chain, they're typically small projects that evolve. I was talking to Fran O'Sullivan from IBM the other day, and she actually provides line of business funding to be able to do test and learn with analytics continually, because we don't know what we're going to learn, and it really requires that innovation funding. The traditional way of buying software was a licensed deployment, and now it's so great to see the movement into cloud-based deployments. And to move from past structured transactional data, unstructured and structured data together, and data with high velocity. And, in the old days, it was led by IT, and now many of these projects are led by the business. And the focus is outside in. It's really, how do I translate and sense from the shelf? How do I test and learn? It's no longer just about the better response. and how do I evolve with small vendors? And so it's a different world. And so as people think about digital and how to get started, what I wanted to do was to go back and say, where would I start? I would start with a problem that's really important to you. I would get people in a whiteboard, and I would analyze the data, and I'd look at new forms of analytics and think hard about what data should be used, and what could you do if you listen, and what could you do differently if you test and learned, and how would you adapt? And then how can you use the confluence of technologies? How can you use the Internet of Things? How can you use 3D printing? How can you use robotics? How can you really bring these new forms of analytics together? And then, what's possible in the design of digital processes, right? Like the biomedical engineer that brought a baby heart out of his pocket. I would never have conceived of, that as a future process. But what's possible? And how do we really build these outside in and then be open to the outcome? I go to conferences all the time and people say we have best practices, and I laugh. Supply chain is very new. We're only 30 years into it. I think we've got to really say, we're evolving, and it's a great future ahead of us. So, Allison, what questions do you have?
So I had one question come through, and I have put out a message to everyone. If you do have additional questions, send them through now. Let me just scroll back for a second. What are some of the hurdles of adopting technologies that will enable this digital pivot?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is funding. People that are doing the most work on digital actually are able to work innovation funding. The traditional project requires a firm ROI and requires, known projects. So often somebody will say, I want to be a leader, I want to do innovative things, but I need a fixed ROI, and I'm like, the two can't go together, right? And so the people that are working on digital path to purchase or cognitive learning have a budget for investment with unknown outcomes. And that's a very different way of thinking about technology. And it's very different to have small projects that evolve with unknown outcomes, right? Because most people want a definitive ROI, they want a definitive project plan, they want a clear outcome, and this is a different way of doing business. And that's really a hurdle for people to get over.
Okay, we get another question come through. Who are some of the vendors that are doing the most innovative technologies, in your opinion, that we should look at?
Well, we had a number of them at the Global Summit. We did a digital showcase, and I'm hoping that more people can join us next year. Savvy Technologies is doing some great work on streaming technology, Internet of Things, on-time deliveries using GPS and telematics. Intera Solutions is doing a good job about building rules-based ontologies to really redefine master data and to do multiple ifs to multiple thens. Rethink Robotics brought their robots, and Jabel talked about the digital supply chain and their use of robotics. And Mitch Free is busy building 3D printing. I think he has his third company now doing it at UPS. It's called Fast Radius on 3D printing. And, we've got a variety of other companies, doing some predictive and prescriptive analytics, but those are the ones that were showcased in our digital showcase.
Okay. It doesn't look like we have any other questions in queue, so I'm going to take a moment and see if anyone has any last-minute questions they want to send through before we start to wrap up. Laura?
Well, I'm hoping that people will come to our new community, beatfusion.com. The community is built to help supply chain leaders to evolve new processes. I named it Beat Fusion for a reason, because it's a community that's designed to be the superfood for the supply chain. It's an online community that allows people to discuss, to share. We've loaded 800,000 pages of our content in, but it's not about us. Anybody can share content. We have 400 people that have joined us in the last 2 days. It's still an open beta. And we hope that everybody can join it and share. I think it's a great opportunity for us to change the discussion.
Excellent. We just had a question come through. How does a supply chain become cognitive?
Well, it requires the investment in cognitive learning technologies, which there are a couple of companies that are working on this. Tools Group is doing some work in Milan, and Terra Solutions is doing some work. They actually came out of the Department of Defense. Terra Technologies is doing some work on attribute-based planning to prescriptive analytics. Google's doing a lot of work around prescriptive analytics into the supply chain. Trufa is doing a lot of work around prescriptive analytics on SAP. So it's a new best-of-breed category that's evolving. That's quite exciting. And, you know, we can't forget that IBM just created a whole division for Watson, so I'm hoping Watson can do more than play chess soon.
All right, so it looks like there was the last question. So as the community manager for B-Fusion, I do want to echo Laura's statement about joining the community. I know I've been talking to actually someone from Tools Group about putting their infographic in about Costa Coffee. So for those of you out there that would like to join the B-Fusion community and help us make this digital pivot, I do encourage that. Laura, any last-minute things to wrap up before I shut the presentation down?
You know, I'm hoping people will follow the methodology. You know, becoming digital is used a lot as a buzzword. Big data is used a lot as a buzzword. Outside in is used a lot as a buzzword. What I'm hoping people do is take the steps and they really drive new innovation, outside in thinking to really drive growth. And I think supply chain needs to be the engine of growth, and I think it can be. So let us know how we can help. Thank you, Allison.
Excellent. Thanks, Laura, and thanks to all of you that had joined us today. A few things to wrap up. As we mentioned, I got a couple of questions from folks in the audience. We are sending out the link to this recording as well as the slides. We'll send those two links out to you tomorrow. So keep an eye out for an email from either myself, Allison Crawford, or from Supply Chain Insights if we do a campaign that way. And you'll be able to get all the content that we've talked about today. And if you have questions for Laura, once you've reviewed this content and had a chance to digest, please do reach out to either one of us. You know, our primary goal here at Supply Chain Insights is to help you improve your supply chain and transform your business. So please feel free to reach out. We can be reached at laura.ciceri@supplychaininsights.com or allison.crawford@supplychaininsights.com. So with that, we also encourage you to follow us on social media, on Twitter, join our company page on LinkedIn, and follow us on SlideShare. And again, if you have any questions about your supply chain, please reach out to us. We're here to help. Thanks, everyone, and have a great afternoon.